After 4 brutal years of the most immense war in American history, the sounds of conflict gradually faded and the haze from the Civil War started to clear. A single fact was now utterly obvious. The Confederate forces were defeated. The nation could at last assess the full scope of the catastrophe. Southern cities lay in devastation, and a grim reality surfaced as 700,000 souls had perished. Yet one pressing and unresolved issue remained. What was to be done with 300,000 rebels and an entire Congress of past foes? Ought the victor severely punish every one of them for countless war crimes? Or does a different answer exist for such a difficult problem? When Ulysses Grant and Robert Lee met on April 9, 1865, at the McLean House in Appomattox Court House to settle the conditions for the surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, Lee was entirely uncertain of his fate. He had told one of his men merely hours earlier that he would accept the results for his deeds. For all he knew, he could be jailed. Lee was surely grateful when Grant wrote terms that contained these conditions. The officers were to provide their personal pledges to not bear arms against the United States government until officially exchanged. Once this was done, every officer and soldier could go back to his residence and would not be molested by United States power. That is to say, the conflict is over. Go home and act peacefully, and we will leave you alone. Apart from the occupying Union armies posted throughout the South for almost 10 years in Reconstruction, the majority of ordinary troops on each side set down their rifles and went home. They were predominantly farmers' children. Consequently, they went back to their family land and helped grow tobacco, cotton, or raise cattle. Some aided in reconstructing the war-ravaged or demolished mills, bridges, tanneries, structures, highways, and railways. Near the railways, fresh towns emerged, providing farmers' sons new opportunities in urban areas. Certain former soldiers moved to Western territories. Let us look into the recollections of an everyday former Confederate soldier. I had a modest farm, and it is true my family possessed several slaves who had been emancipated. Astonishingly, the freed slaves indicated a desire to remain with us. Choosing a new beginning, we resolved to go to Texas. I, having a wife and 2 small kids, traveled to Texas with our previous household of slaves. They had 4 kids. We cooperated to raise 2 dog-trot cabins, laboring together as previous slaveholders and former slaves, establishing a new existence as neighbors. Let us discuss the paramount leaders of the Civil War, the Confederate General-in-Chief and President, Robert Lee and Jefferson Davis. President Lincoln granted Robert Lee a pardon after he yielded at Appomattox Court House on April 9, 1865. He could not go back to his home in Arlington, Virginia, since it was converted into a national cemetery overlooking the tombs of many Union soldiers. No matter what occurred, he refused to abandon Virginia. "I cannot abandon my native state in her time of trouble," he stated to an associate. "I must endure her destiny and participate in her fate." Instead, Lee and his relatives moved to Lexington, Virginia, where he was appointed president of Washington College. Legend says he took this humble post with a salary of just $1,500 annually because he believed it was wrong to profit from such a vicious and gory war. Washington College grew in size and wealth over the subsequent 5 years, and Lee's close relationship with numerous pupils reflected his aim to create a fresh generation of American. Lee signed an amnesty oath in 1865, aiming to regain his status as a United States citizen. He did this to strongly encourage Confederate troops to rejoin the Union. Lee's hope of becoming an American citizen was ultimately crushed by chance. His oath document was lost, and he passed from heart disease on October 12, 1870, still deemed only a visitor in his homeland. Lee's oath was found in the National Archives a full century later. Jefferson Davis and the rest of the Confederate government escaped Richmond on April 2, 1865, as the Union Army advanced on the Confederate capital. On May 10th, Union troops captured Davis in Irwinville, Georgia, and held him for 2 years at Fort Monroe in Virginia. Davis was charged, though never prosecuted for treason, and freed on bond in May 1867. Davis's mental and bodily condition had deteriorated during his imprisonment. After he spent 2 years touring Europe and employed at an insurance firm, he and his family went back to Memphis, Tennessee. In 1876, they went to the Mississippi Gulf Coast, where a supporter named Sarah Dorsey allowed them to live in a cottage on her coastal property near Biloxi. Dorsey willed her estate, Beauvoir, to Davis and his family upon her death. He would live there for his remaining years, finally composing his war account in a 2-volume work named The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government in 1881. Davis died in New Orleans in December 1889 from acute bronchitis. Davis's remains were transferred and interred again in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, the former Confederate capital, in 1893. Not all soldiers and officers were fortunate to begin anew as though nothing occurred. Certain deeds were inexcusable, and the hands of these people were already too deeply covered in blood. In early 1864, Henry Wirz was placed in command of the Andersonville prison, officially called Camp Sumter. While each side detained convicts in awful circumstances, Andersonville merits particular notice for the appalling environment in which its captives were kept. A stockade confined thousands of troops on a filthy tract of land. A small creek flowed through the compound, supplying water for Union troops, but it soon turned into a source of sickness and human waste. Almost 13,000 of over 45,000 detainees sent to Andersonville perished there. After the conflict, Wirz was apprehended in May 1865 and tried by a military court in August on charges that he had plotted to harm the health and end the lives of troops in the military service of the United States. Wirz was court-martialed, convicted on every charge, and sentenced to death by hanging. Notorious guerrilla combatants met the same end. Samuel Champ Ferguson dissolved his gang and returned to his farm when the war concluded. Learning of his return, the Union Army seized him and took him to Nashville, where a military tribunal found him guilty of 53 murders. Ferguson stated he had personally slain more than 100 individuals and confessed that his group had killed many of the named casualties. He claimed this conduct was merely a component of his soldiers' responsibilities. Ferguson and his guerrilla unit were infamous for their role in the Battle of Saltville, where they executed wounded Union troops and captives. The 5th United States Colored Cavalry, which was comprised completely of black soldiers, along with their white officers, were the targets. Accusations were leveled against Ferguson and his men for murdering injured victims while they lay in hospital beds. The prisoners had nearly been slaughtered, saved only by the arrival of Thomas's legion of Cherokee Indians and Highlanders. Ferguson promptly withdrew his men and departed after learning that regular Confederate forces had come. For these offenses, he was court-martialed and hanged. Henry Magruder was convicted on 17 counts of murder, assault with intent to kill, and rape. The court also sentenced him to death by hanging. The third executed guerrilla is Marcellus Jerome Clark, who murdered 3 soldiers, captured 4 prisoners, and wrecked the burned railroad depot. Yet, not every Confederate was ready to admit that the conflict was nearing its conclusion. Some soldiers decided to reject their commander's surrender at Appomattox Court House, and in the subsequent capitulations, planning to join another Confederate force. Instead of accepting defeat, some of Kirby Smith's troops marched toward Mexico after his final surrender. In the following years, many such soldiers who had refused to accept surrender when the war ended continued to resist the federal government and establish paramilitary organizations like the Ku Klux Klan throughout the Reconstruction era. Many countries attempted to attract Southerners amid the turmoil following the Civil War, primarily for political and farming reasons. For example, Mexico's Emperor Maximilian provided tax breaks and property. Property and tax incentives were also offered by the Venezuelan leadership. Furthermore, an Ottoman viceroy in Egypt hired former Union and Confederate officers to help in the invasion of Ethiopia. The Confederate ally Dom Pedro II of Brazil, who had offered Southern vessels provisions and harbor during the Civil War, provided the greatest incentives, however. He guaranteed the Confederates immediate citizenship, covered their travel to Brazil, gave them land for as little as 22 cents per acre, and sometimes even greeted them when they landed. Slavery remained legal then in Brazil, a nation that had imported more enslaved people than the United States over its history. Slavery was not abolished there until 1888. However, these American settlers were never capable of reproducing the huge slave-holding plantations of the Deep South. Those who moved to Brazil were not wealthy plantation owners. They were middle-class agriculturists, doctors, instructors, and engineers. They were not inflexible slave owners, and numerous came from families that had long been frontiersmen. As many as 3,500 Confederates resided in Municipality Americana and nearby regions at its peak in the late 1800s. While the community married and practiced interfaith marriage initially, the generations born in Brazil were much more likely to move to Brazil's urban centers or become more assimilated into society generally.